Hello, this is Mrs. Overmeyer, and this workshop is on the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium as it applies to populations. And so what we're going to do is first we're going to go over some of the vocabulary that is important in order to work the problems. And then we're also going to go over the equations. And then we'll get into problem solving. So let's look at the vocabulary. When we talk about genotypes, that's referring to the combination of alleles that the organism inherits from its parents. So remember that organisms inherit one allele for a trait from each parent. So if the organism inherits a dominant allele from both parents, its genotype is going to be homozygous dominant, and it's going to look something like this. So we're going to use T to represent our alleles, and so it would be big T, right? So that would be homozygous dominant. If an organism is homozygous recessive, that means that it's inherited a recessive allele from each parent. And so we would represent the homozygous recessive genotype with little t. And then if it's heterozygous, that means that it's inherited one dominant allele and one recessive allele. And so we can express that in this way, right? So we know that our dominant alleles are capital letters, and the recessive alleles are always represented by the lowercase letters. Now, let's look down here at our equations. So there's two equations you can use to solve these problems. And the one I like to use first, and that's a hint for these problems that you're going to do. The one I like to use first is just P plus Q equals 1. So P plus Q. So what does P and Q stand for? Well, P always represents the dominant allele. So we're going to put P in here, and then Q always represents the recessive allele, right? So if we think about it, if P represents one dominant allele, then P squared would represent the homozygous dominant genotype, right? And if Q represents the recessive allele, right, then it makes sense that Q squared would represent the homozygous recessive genotype. And for the heterozygous genotype, it's represented by a big T and a little t, and so we need a P and a Q. And so in order to calculate the heterozygous genotype, you always have to do, you take 2 times P times Q, okay? Okay, so now let's go ahead and do one of the problems. So it says allele T, which is a dominant, capital T for a dominant allele, represents the ability to taste a particular chemical, and it's dominant over allele T, little t, for the inability to taste the chemical. 400 university students were surveyed, and 64 were found to be non-tasters. Calculate the percentage of heterozygous students. Assume that the population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And so what we're looking for is the percentage of heterozygous students. So this is what we're looking for right here, heterozygous. And so that would be, we want to know the percentage of this genotype. So this is what we're looking for. So we know that T is the dominant allele, so that's going to be P. we know that little t is going to equal q. So the first thing we look at is, okay, so how can we figure out what either P or Q is? Because in order to find the heterozygous percentage of students, we have to have 2PQ, right? We have to know this, 2 times P times Q. So we need to know both of those variables. Well, it says 64 were found to be non-tasters. So if 64 were found to be non-tasters, that means that 64 out of 400, that's going to equal the homozygous genotype, which also gives us Q squared, right? So we just need to figure out what is 64 divided by 400. So how do we do that? Right, we just take 64 divided by 400, and that gives us 0.16. So now we know that Q equals Q squared equals 0.16. However, we need Q. So we need to square both sides. So we're going to square this side. Get that back here. So we're going to square this side, and we're going to square this side of the equation, and now we have Q is equal to 0.4, right? So now we have 2 times P times 0.4, right? So now we need to find P. Well, remember that one of the equations we can use is P plus Q equals 1. And so now all we have to do to find P is to substitute in and rearrange this equation to solve for P. So P equals 1 minus Q, or P equals 1 minus 0.4. So P is going to equal 0.6, right? So now we know the allele, the dominant allele frequency. We know the frequency of the recessive allele. So now we have to plug the P and the Q in to 2PQ. So 2PQ equals 2 times 0.6 times 0.4. And what do we get? .48, right? So the percentage of heterozygous students is 48%. Well, let's, try another one. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so let's move this up a little bit. Up. Example 2. In corn, purple kernels are dominant to yellow. A random sample of 100 kernels is taken from a population in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and it's found that 9 kernels are yellow and 91 kernels are purple. Well, we know that purple kernels are dominant to yellow. So we're going to use T. We'll use T for the purple kernels. and little t for the yellow. The only reason I'm not using capital P is because capital P is in our Hardy-Weinberg equation for purple. Okay, so in order to do this, it says 9 kernels are yellow. So we know that 9 out of 100 are homozygous recessive. So 9 out of 100 is going to equal Q squared. And we can simplify this by saying Q squared is equal to 0.09. In order to find Q then, we take the square root of both sides and we end up with Q equals 0.3. So now that we have Q equals 0.3, we can plug that in to our equation, right? And 1 minus 0.3 is going to equal P. And so P is equal to 0.7. So now we've found the allele frequencies for the both the recessive allele and the dominant allele. But what they wanted to know is what is the frequency of the yellow allele. So which one is the yellow allele? It's the recessive allele. So our answer is 0.3, right? Because Q is our recessive allele. Okay, well, I hope that helps. And if you have questions, let me know.